Modernity, simply put, does not have men because modernity is incapable of producing men. The concept of maleness, manhood, masculinity is itself not a physical thing. It's not something like the sand that I could pick up, feel between my fingers. It's not tangible in that sense, and yet it's more real than the tangible world that we experience in the physical sense of experiencing. And this is true for many of the higher levels of ontological reality. The more existent things like justice, like love, like peace, harmony, these are not things that we can pick up, weigh, measure, dissect, cut into small pieces, and yet they are more real than the things that we immediately experience in a physical sense. And masculinity comes from that realm. It comes from the realm of the primordial. It is part of the dyadic expression of the Tao. Another way to say that, it is part of the transcendence and immanence of God. Another way to say that, it is part of the stern names of God and the gentle names of God, which we call the Yin and the Yang. Of course, this is a way to simplify the language because there's not actually a lot of benefit in using overly complex language to understand and describe and contemplate something which is rather intuitive. We see quite palpably, quite immediately, the day alternate with the night, in hot, in polarity with cold, left in contrast with right, the opposites existing in harmony. And among the strongest manifestations of this sacred dyadic, the sacred two, which are rooted in the sacred one, the yin and yang, is the male and female, the masculine and the feminine. And so when we say that masculinity is rooted in the primordial, it is to highlight that it is not just some psychological trick or some feature of culture. It's not a social construct. It's not something that you can engineer out of society, even though that's what people try to do these days. It's not something you're going to eliminate because it's primordial. It's so deeply rooted into the fabric of reality that in many ways, the essence of it, is more real than a lot of the manifestations of it that we might attribute to masculinity, to attribute to maleness, to manhood. And you could say perhaps the same thing about femininity, the feminine, the yin energy. But particularly with masculinity, it can't exist in modernity because modernity is axiologically materialist in all of its different iterations of thought. So it doesn't matter whether you're using an economic lens and thinking about the world as capitalist or communist, or whether you're thinking about it in a postmodernist lens using the concepts of, power structures and how they interrelate, like Foucault, or whether you're simply using the excessively empirical lens of scientism, which wants to take everything which the pre-modern people understood to be imbued with the sacred, imbued with the primordial, you could even say enchanted, and then reduce it to its base, to its materiality alone. To say that I am not a soul with consciousness. I'm just the atoms that make up my body, that constitute my physicality. And when you do this philosophically, when you reduce the sacred to the mundane, when you reduce the spiritual and the meaningful to the simply physical, to the simply random expression, according to the modernist lens, of laws of physics themselves, which seem to be arbitrarily in place, also by randomness. What you do unintentionally is you make the primordial mythology. So if we're just materiality, then masculinity in its real true meaning doesn't even exist. And if it doesn't exist, what are we to expect in modernity other than a failure of masculinity to express itself in a balanced, harmonized, and you could even say true way? It is impossible. You cannot manifest something in a holistic manner that you at the same time suggest in your philosophical substrata doesn't even exist. So then we look at a lot of the criticisms that you will hear perhaps in the educational sphere. The boys are falling behind, they're lazy, there's something wrong, crisis of manhood, what's wrong with the boys? You're never going to get solutions out of these people because they are operating on a philosophy that produces the same problems they're criticizing and that they're complaining about and noticing. It is, in this sense, an impossible problem. You at once want to affirm empiricism, materiality of everything, and use that to then justify, the doctrines of freedom and hyper-individualism, which we're all experiencing in these different ways. But then, because it's not working out, because the boys are falling behind, there is a crisis of masculinity. Men are not okay. They're not really men in many different ways. So you're criticizing it, but you're actually operating on, you could say, the operating system, the fundamental programming that produces the thing that you're criticizing. And so to get out of that, you have to become more aware of what the underlying assumptions are, which are very quietly woven into the fabric of your thinking without you even noticing. And without doing that, you will, more often than not, continue to recreate a lot of the dysfunctions because modernity itself is incapable of producing masculinity. And so you can't use modernity to produce masculinity. You need a stronger, more clarified and well-oriented understanding of what is real, what is not real, what you are not, and what the masculine essence is, what it is not. To do that, of course, now you need the feminine essence to contrast, to compare, because it is through the contrast and comparison that we understand the yin and the yang. You can't even really understand much of anything without contrast. It's one of the secrets of knowledge itself, is to understand negation before you have affirmation. You understand things through opposites. And so when you have a society, a culture, a civilization, and it's hard to use those words independently without excluding the others, because when we talk about modernity, even though the ideas came vis-a-vis the colonial project, imperialism, and then later neo-imperialism or neocolonialism through the, Pax Americana, through television, through pop culture, through these different things. While it started in what we call the West, it's no longer a Western thing. The ideas have been so thoroughly spread throughout the world that you have modernist thinking just as much in East Asia as you do in the so-called West, just as much in, sub-Saharan Africa as you do anywhere else. We're all on the internet together. We're all sharing the same thinking patterns and cultural behaviors. And so unintentionally, we begin to imbibe the thinking of modernity, and then we become modernites in a sense. And with that, without even realizing it, we start operating on that thought process. And so we subconsciously, as a group, as a species, as a collective reality of contemporary, human consciousness, we begin to destroy aspects of ourselves, in this case, the topic being masculinity, without even realizing it. And then we're stuck somewhere, both witnessing the problem, experiencing the problem, saying, man, there's a crisis of masculinity, there's something wrong with men, right? They're like detached, they're unfocused, they're undriven. And you hear this criticism wielded by women especially because they're the ones that get a certain experience of the male that the male doesn't get, of course. So like, you don't need to go far to hear the criticism from women, there's no real men these days. So while their criticism has flaws, it's important to look at the reality of it, which is, yes, there are no real men. Even if they don't mean it in the same way that we mean it, that's fine. There are no real men these days, figuratively speaking. Because even the concept of masculinity being reality is subtextually challenged. It's like it doesn't exist. So how could there be a real man if we say that real men, as an essence, doesn't even exist? If we say that everything is arbitrary, and we say that it's only a function of biology, we're going to reduce it, for example, down to testosterone, and then start comparing ourselves to chimpanzees. But no, we're much more than that. You've cut out the spiritual element. You've cut out the reality of masculinity, which is, again, transcendent and rooted in the primordial. And so what we should hope for, strive for, and work on is to identify the blockages in ourself where we're operating unknowingly on ideas that root masculinity into the material instead of into the spiritual. And this is an individual process in the sense that you have to look inside yourself for your own blockages. Someone else can't look inside of you and determine what your thinking process is from bottom to top and top to bottom. That's something for you to figure out. But if you sit on it internally and contemplate and really try to go deep inwardly, you will find places in your own thinking where you're associating the masculine essence with something animalistic, something physical, something mundane, something coarse, and you have to learn to elevate that analysis and realize those are fallacies. Masculinity is more than that, deeper than that, more profound than that. It's a spiritual reality. It's something rooted in the primordial. It is part of the sacred dyadic. It is the sacred yang in contrast to the sacred yin. And when you start to see it through this lens, you can begin to polish the rust on that portion of your mirror and reflect a more pure light. And this is something that we should all strive for in an age where masculinity has become so patently dysfunctional.